everyone. My name is Nathan Hessling, and I will be debating the topic of net neutrality with Josh Dudley. I will be presenting the argument as opposed to net neutrality, and Josh will be in support of net neutrality, and I'll be explaining what that is right now. So, the concept of net neutrality is uh, the idea that service providers should treat all content flow equally. So, all internet traffic should be treated equally, meaning that ISPs cannot favor certain competitors if they do, or certain services by other companies. It's meaning thing to give more of an example, AT&T can't favor Netflix over Hulu, so they can't have an agreement where you get their services and Netflix if you get their services, and then they provide quicker speeds to Netflix as well. Under the Net Neutrality Open Internet Order Act of 2015, that was a no-go. But come 2018, that act was repealed, or so that order was then repealed. So a little bit of history on net neutrality is the concept of net neutrality has been around since I believe it was the Clinton administration, is what I saw, Bill Clinton. So the FCC came up with this idea, and they decided that over the course of the next few years, they would try multiple times to enact regulations on the internet on ISPs. So come 2005 until 2012, they attempted 5 times and failed. But then they attempted again in 2015, and they succeeded. This regulation got imposed, so the order was passed. 3 years later, with a change of chairman, Ajit Pai later repealed this order with the Restoring Internet Freedom Order. So my first argument, being opposed to the concept of net neutrality, so the order from 2015 to 2018, is I think from a libertarian standpoint that we should have as little government as possible from our day-to-day lives. I view the government as a necessary evil. I think that it's important to have to prevent anarchy, but it can easily fall into totalitarianism. So I generally am against the government's hands in most matters, such as net neutrality. And I think here the FCC was attempting to give the government more power to have more of a hand in our day-to-day lives in the case of regulating ISPs. So I'll go into the benefits of unregulated ISPs the way it is now in a few slides, but my opinion on government regulation is that we should keep it to an absolute minimum, and that's because when the FCC proposed the idea back in 2015 and got passed, there was no real reason that it should have been passed. It was just that the FCC foresaw a possibility that ISPs start prioritizing traffic for personal gain rather than keeping it, fair and equal to a certain extent. So because the FCC was nervous of something like this happening, they passed that order, and it went through. So in my opinion, there shouldn't have been any order to begin with because it wasn't really fixing anything. It was just preventing something that they were worried about happening, and everything worked just fine and perfectly up until that moment. And it continued to work. It was a little different, but it later did get repealed, so it's difficult to say what the long term would have looked like. But in essence, I think that we should be keeping as minimal government power or as minimal government influence as possible. I mean, there was no reason to give the government a hand in internet regulation, ISP regulation, outside of the regulations that are already imposed on companies. That this was just an excuse for somebody or for people in power to get more power. And I think that's all that the government really cares about, is eventually giving itself more power. The government receives money from the people, and they're always increasing our taxes all the time. And they receive money from the people regardless of whether or not they want to. People have to pay taxes wherever you go, sales tax, depending on where you live, income tax. Everybody's got to pay income tax and all that. But ISPs and businesses, they have to pander the consumer because the consumer can go to a competitor. They have other options. They don't have to use their services. They have more than one option. Where we have the government, that's our option. We have to pay to live here, which makes sense to a certain extent, but there are limits. But that's not what my argument's about. So the next point I'd like to touch on is the prioritization Internet of Things. I think that if we can better prioritize internet traffic, certain types of internet traffic, if we leave it deregulated. For example, if we have somebody who's in an emergency and they use their phone, watch, or some other emergency device to send out a signal to first responders to get help, I think that that signal should be prioritized. I think that in most cases people should agree that is the ethically sound decision, because somebody who's in an emergency, somebody who's been in a serious car crash, or somebody who's, an elderly person who's, gotten injured and needs to go to the hospital, or whatever it might be, I think that that traffic should be prioritized, and I think that Congress is currently at risk of trying to re-regulate the internet, because Congress was opposed to the FCC's decision in 2018 to deregulate it. I think that if we keep it deregulated, we can let the ISPs prioritize emergency communications such as that to first responders, instead of some kid streaming Fortnite to his 5 other viewers on Twitch. I don't think that's as important as somebody's emergency situation, a life or death situation. And I think that we can prioritize things. And I think it's necessary to prioritize some internet traffic over others, and not to just say everything's fair and equal. Socialism isn't always the right answer. But to continue on with that point, from a technological standpoint in regards to advancements, PwC, this company is a consultant firm style of company, but they specialize more on the side of cybersecurity. They say that if we leave the internet deregulated, this could benefit Internet of Things wearables, delivery drones, and driverless cars. That means that we have more, cool tech gadgets that provide us with more features and more productivity benefits on our person. Because I know that I use my phone on a regular basis, and that tool is extremely beneficial outside of just scrolling through Instagram and Facebook. And then delivery drones would be a sweet concept. I mean, it's something that's still in the works, but to get Amazon to send out a delivery drone to get your package to you in, a few hours would be phenomenal. We just got to get these farmers to stop shooting them down. And then, thirdly, I think driverless cars are definitely the future. I mean, every car manufacturer is trying to, improve its automation for driverless cars. There's technically 6 levels to driving automation, and it goes 0 through 5. So 0 meaning no automation at all, and 5 being complete automation. So that means like Google's car that they did like 5 or 6 years ago. I can't remember what it's called right now, but if you Google uh, Google's car, fully automatic vehicle, you should see this tiny little, you know, crappy looking vehicle that they souped up and let it drive by itself, and it did. I mean, it was in a controlled environment and it wasn't allowed to go faster than 25 miles per hour, and I believe that was also another government regulation. But maybe that one was worth it because you don't want anyone to get injured. Regardless, though, um, advancements like this could be far more possible and widespread if we allow ISPs to control network traffic and to speed up things like connections to the necessary servers for driverless cars so that they can respond quicker, or they can provide information, or if a mistake does happen and an emergency does occur, these driverless cars might have the potential to immediately send out a signal in case the person that was in the accident is incapacitated. I think delivery drones, the ability, I mean, they're obviously going to have to be connected to the internet. They're going to have to know where to go to drop off packages, and where to update the information that the package has been delivered or something happened to the package in transit. I think that all of these things would benefit immensely from free internet, from the freedom of the internet, not net neutrality. Uh, Robin Borstling, and I hope I'm not butchering her name saying that, but she's the vice president of infrastructure, innovation, and HR policy of the National Association of Manufacturers. She said the continued investment in networks led by the private sector allow for improvements and upgrades that keep economic growth moving in a positive direction and give the U.S. a competitive advantage. A regulatory regime that holds back the development and deployment of the latest manufacturing technology would be a step in the wrong direction. And basically, what she's saying is that we need to keep uh, shooting for these technological advancements and not regulate them, because regulation slows down progression, and we should always strive to be, better than yesterday, and we should always strive to improve our technology as well. So I 100% agree with her.
My name's Josh Dudley, and I believe that net neutrality is a very critical topic when dealing with the standpoint of a market. We know that the United States has one of the largest markets in the world. It makes tons of money on our technology, vehicles, and things like that. So I find it important because the internet opens up a ton of opportunities for a company to strive. And basically, the internet was designed as an open opportunity for anyone, and is one of the very few things the government hadn't gotten involved in until recent years. Um, well, I believe that the government has poked their nose in many things that they probably shouldn't have, or I believe that they shouldn't have. But I do believe it is important for the government to get involved with net neutrality. Um, the internet has become vital purpose to our way of life, being almost as important as the lights that keep a business open at dark. Um, Without net neutrality, we kind of open up the opportunity for internet service providers to profit off the bandwidths they send to others, or whatever restrictions they can add. This also means a company could offer a large sum of money to take on a huge portion of the bandwidth, just to leave their competitions without, or leaving a higher bill for their competition, um, which I believe that it kind of defeats the purpose of the idea of competition. A true competition should be based on the product that's being produced, and the way that an organization has to offer, and how they outsource it, and just basically anything about the product. Internet service providers, like any company, strive to profit, and profits could be large if wealthy companies like Facebook or Google were able to take on a large portion of bandwidth, and use it for themselves so that their users could have a better experience, and they could push further into other technologies with an increase like this. Increasing the number of employees, and allow the number of employees to work on different networks and whatnot, which I believe would end up making smaller companies trying to enter these markets, to compete with these larger ones, a much difficult task, given that the expected budget to just finance their internet service providers would be increasingly high, and could actually make it harder for them to produce what they want to make. Um, these increase of costs from to their internet service providers isn't free, and the company will need to find a way to make up for their losses by possibly charging their users for their services just to make up for those losses. So you could see things like maybe somewhere down the line Facebook charging $2 a month to use their service, because they're now having to spend more money on their internet service provider just to keep up with all the other companies purchasing further and further more into their internet service provider. So without net neutrality, we kind of open up a new market, and a market based solely on aggressive actions to other companies. These aggressive actions could be something like, Facebook taking more bandwidth than they need just to slow down other social media companies like MySpace or something like that. This would, they both had the same market. They're both in the same market. They're trying to produce something new, and Facebook could have the upper hand just based off of the money that they already have. And I believe that that's not really fair. I think everybody should deserve an equal opportunity when producing something, because if not, we run into the idea of monopolism, and that these type of things need to be adjusted, and it requires a little bit of government focus. So for a company to increase their bandwidth, it forces the ISP, which isn't too mad about it, but to increase their prices of use which in return will increase operation costs for some of these smaller companies trying to get in the market to be a competitor, and it just basically destroys the opportunity of a fair chance in a race to create a new product, um, all based on the amount of money that one company may have. And if this begins, you start to see less competition, and bigger companies are going to start to take over these markets in a whole, because of how much money they have and how much reach they can get. Um, but having competition in a market is obviously really good. Um, the success of advancing in technology runs off of who invented what, who's inventing it faster, and when are they going to put out their product before the other. But and not only to mention that, you know, when you have competition, you're not stuck with one type of product. With many competitions, you have so many different options that are much different than one another. But the thing is that if one is producing way quicker than the other, then they could easily outrun the smaller competition. So to the point of maybe without net neutrality, we can put more focus on things like cool products like driverless cars and drones that would completely change the world. I do think that would be absolutely amazing if they focus more into these things. Would be actually really beneficial to have more bandwidth sent over there. This way they can spread out their research and their production faster. However, I think it's a little unfair, like you said, with Google created a driverless car, but there are many companies also working on driverless cars, such as Tesla, Uber, and Ford, which brings the point of neutrality. Everyone should be given the chance to create a market for themselves, and this would be almost not impossible, but really hard to do if someone like Google, who possesses a very large market and a ton of assets, decides let's monopolize the auto industry, and do so purchasing a large majority of things like bandwidth and increasing their ISP costs, just so places like Ford, who has which is a net profiting company of roughly 84 million, to struggle to keep up with such a large company like Google, who has a net income of roughly 35 billion a year. My point is, though, Ford is a conglomerate of a company. It still doesn't come anywhere near the same possessions of Google. And with that kind of money, I feel like Google could dominate that market by just simply increasing their spending on things like to their internet provider, and which would also have to increase Ford's you know price, or costs, which I believe that they should both be given an equal opportunity to further advance in the market they know, and give themselves more room for advancement, which I don't think would be possible if they're using a simple way of basically holding back another company just by using more and more spending in certain things. Um, I mean, this doesn't mean stopping or slowing Google from their dream of a self-driving car, but not using their power of wealth just to slow down competition. You know, this would require a bit of more regulation. However, these regulations have been put in place for many years. Like having these regulations prevents the idea of monopolizing the internet for benefits.
Another point I'd like to address is the privacy concern with net neutrality. I think that giving the government more influence and more control over the regulation of network traffic uh, gives the opportunity for the government to interfere on our privacy even more so than it already does. As it is, the government collects tons of data on the people just based on the different things we do on a day-to-day basis. And it's not just the government that collects this data. I mean, companies like Google and Facebook, we've seen that they can collect this data too. Um, and it's it happens all the time. But if we give the government, the the biggest essentially entity in the United States, the ability to gather more of our information, I feel a lot of people would be uncomfortable with that. Um, I think as it is, the government has too much interference in our day-to-day lives and too much knowledge of what we do on a day-to-day basis, that letting it control and regulate internet traffic is only going to potentially give it another method of gathering more information on us. I think that this initial law of regulating internet traffic could quickly evolve into the ability for the government to tap into this network traffic as well, if it's not already a part of the Open Internet Order of 2015. I think that most people will agree with me when we say that we prefer our lives and our network traffic be kept to the few people that it's intended to go to and from, or anybody at all if it's not meant for anybody else, if it's meant to be private completely. So I do think that uh, having the government control whether or not the network or the internet is neutral just gives them another opportunity to spy on us. I think Josh made some good points voicing the concerns of potential monopolization amongst ISPs. Um, but I do think that we have laws in place right now that prevent monopolies from occurring. I mean, you can see it all the time. Larger companies trying to consume, but other larger companies are merged together. The government gets involved in situations like that and deems whether or not it's a monopoly. And if it is, then it doesn't allow that merge to occur. So we see that in a day-to-day, or not necessarily on a day-to-day basis, but we see that nowadays already. So that's not some law that needs to be implemented. That's already there. I think when it comes to ISPs and net neutrality, it's more over the concern of the Open Internet Order Act of 2015 and how it got shot down or got taken, repealed in 2018. I think that if we let ISPs regulate their own traffic, it provides more of a free market competition than if we allow the government to get their hands in another aspect of our lives. I think the government is the largest monopoly in America, and I think allowing them to regulate another aspect of our lives, internet traffic, just gives them more power in their monopoly. Because the primary concern over net neutrality is who actually regulates the traffic. The government, which gets taxes from the people that live in the country no matter what, so it really doesn't have to pander to the people, and we've seen more and more every day that it doesn't. But consumers who make a living and make money off of the consumer that purchases their services has to appeal to the consumer and thus uh, change prices and services to match the needs of the consumer.
Nathan brings up a good point about internet privacy with net neutrality. Um, having net neutrality does require obviously a ton more government surveillance, given that the regulations and policies brought into play would need to be surveyed by the government to make sure everybody's treated equally. Um, However, to this date, we see internet providers and other companies shoveling user data to the government, to this date. And if the government really wanted this information, you know, they can get their hands on it very easily, and we've seen this happen. So I don't think net neutrality would really change how that data is being, shared. But like I said before, if the net neutrality was gone, the government would need to make sure that people aren't or companies aren't monopolizing off of this, which would require government surveillance as it is. So it kind of still would be shared amongst them, and not much of the surveillance stuff would really be changed. Um, and another thing with the net neutrality is that if the internet service providers would be in control of how everybody's benefiting off of the internet, or what policies each company would be given. Um, a lot of the times it would be able to have full control of what data is moving in and out, um, which would in return cause the government to really investigate into these internet service providers, making sure that they're not monopolizing off of this. and in return they would need to know, what information is being shared, how much information is being shared. They would have access to all this stuff. So I don't think that privacy would really change compared to having net neutrality and not having net neutrality. I think it's probably about an equal amount of privacy being taken advantage of during that time. Um, so this concludes our debate on net neutrality. Um, while there's like so many topics to be covered about the pros and cons of net neutrality, we were only able to cover a few, hot topics. But those hot topics that we covered were, government control, monopolization, and user privacy. As you heard from Nathan, he had stated during the debate about how he believes that the government should have less and less control, while my thoughts were leaning towards less control of the big businesses. And we also had covered monopolization, where Nathan's argument provided us with information about current regulations set in play to protect ongoing issues of monopolization. And while my argument suggests that these policies takes time and money, and that they're still, struggling to follow with. And then lastly, was privacy. Nathan had stated his concerns about the government having more control over the internet and user data, and how they're still, mining people's data. If the net neutrality was in play, that would mean more government control over these policies would actually lead to more user data out there for them to survey. And while my argument was that I didn't believe that it would change much. Um, so I mean that's really about it. There's a lot to learn about net neutrality, and I don't think that this debate was really able to touch on every aspect of the topic. But I think we both could agree that you should spend some time learning more about the topic and create your own opinion based on what you've read and what you've heard. Because in the end, even though net neutrality has already been shot down, and there's always a chance that this bill may find its way back into a vote later on, and it might behoove you to know a little bit about the topic before voting on it, because there's a lot of things that can come into play when thinking about net neutrality. Thank you.